All right, it's exactly 3 o'clock, so let's start. So, good day, everyone, and thank you for joining, and welcome to our Compliance Insight Roundtable. My name is Pierre Simon, the founder and managing director of Simon Consulting, and also your host for today's session. For crypto asset service providers seeking to operate within the European Union, obtaining a MiCA license will be mandatory. This license signifies compliance with strict standards regarding governance, consumer protection, cybersecurity, and of course, anti money laundering measures. Joining us today to discuss this important topic are three experts in the field: Elisa Veta or Lisa Palasnik, Marcel Thies, and Tommaso Astasi. Welcome. Could you each give a short introduction and touch on your areas of expertise within MiCA? And of course, we will start with Lisa.
Thank you for the invitation to speak and to share the expertise. That's great to be all here together. And I think Tomas and Marcel is the first time we have an event together or we discuss live at least. A lot of behind the scenes, but nothing yet was podcasted. So yes, I'm Elisabetta Palaznik. I'm based as Tommaso in Brussels, and I work as an independent financial regulatory consultant specialized in digital finance. So what I do in a nutshell is basically I help crypto asset service providers and also financial institutions implement different European regulatory framework that those CASP and financial institutions are impacted by, such as MiCA, but also slightly overlooked as well DORA, that CASP will be also impacted.
Great. Marcel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Marcel. I've been in the space for the past almost 8 years, specializing in regulatory compliance for at least 6 years now. Whenever you want to do something, you want to place an asset or issue something, you eventually come across regulatory compliance at some point in a broader sense, right? So over the years, my focus has really shifted to that because each time I was involved in a project or something, we encountered similar issues, right? And so over the past years, I've worked for companies like Binance, entering new markets, getting licenses approved, and going through the whole process of becoming compliant, basically, and shaping and shifting narratives within companies and introducing compliance policies and procedures, from gap analysis to all of that fun, right? So really practical experience and hands-on experience working across departments, and I had the pleasure of working for numerous big companies in the space. I'm currently doing lots of consulting work, mainly for US companies and other companies looking into entering the European market in a broader sense, and basically discovering with them the MiCA implications on their business if they were to pick a jurisdiction, which is a topic of itself.
Exactly. I can relate to the last one. Yeah, definitely. And Tommaso, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks everyone again for the invitation. It's great to be here. My name is Tommaso Stazzi. I'm also in the consulting business. Let's say I'm a senior consultant at mainly at APCO Worldwide, which is a global advisory firm operating in different sectors, but also in the Web3 space. But the reason why I'm here is actually because through APCO, we manage an association, a trade association, which is called Blockchain for Europe, BC for EU in short. Brussels based, of course, and it's one of the main trade associations operating in the advocacy space for the blockchain and crypto sector. And so I'm sure I'm going to bring a bit of a different perspective than the other speakers, but I think that could also be interesting in itself, because in the work that we do through Blockchain for Europe, of course, we are mainly looking at policies and regulations before they are actually laws, right? So with the association, which is now representing 26 blockchain companies and blockchain native companies, so that's also important for us. All of our members are companies that exist because of blockchain technology. So we don't really have members that are, tech companies looking at Web3 or banks or things like that. But the idea is really that the association was one of the leading voices for representing the industry in this policy making process, during which the European institutions developed and then now finalized and are implementing the market in crypto assets regulation, which we're talking about today. So happy to be here to share maybe some thoughts about that type of the process. What questions we're still looking at, and what is still important to understand in this, let's say, final year before MiCA really comes into force fully on the 1st of January 2025. But again, thanks a lot for the invitation. Great to be here.
Exactly. Well, thanks. And thanks to all three of you for the introductions. So for the audience, we want the session to be interactive. So if you have any questions or comments about MiCA, either MiCA licensing or any other topics that are relevant to the topic of today or that we are discussing, please share them in the LinkedIn comments section. And of course, we'll try to address these questions either live or afterwards via the comment section when the session is over. So to get the conversation started, let's begin with a few thoughts from our speakers on preparing for a MiCA license. The challenges, approach, perhaps some common pitfalls that CASP might encounter during the process. Marcel, would you like to kick off?
Oh yeah, sure. I've done that. I did that quite recently. I already mentioned the jurisdiction part, which has huge implication, on itself, because it's tax implications, labor cost, regulator. What type of connections do you have there? What's the regulator's experience with regulating entities and CASPs such as yours, right? So I think Elisa Veda, you also posted something on this recently. You have basically, by the way, posted a lot of useful content over the years. So good work there. We have used multiple of your overviews internally at some of the companies I've worked. So just wanted to thank you for that. And of course, once you tackle that topic, you dig into the scope as well. Like, what parts of it are applicable to my business, right? With a company that I've worked for that are rather international, right? They, like, some of them do rely on reverse solicitation heavily, right? And jurisdictions like Germany have already had a quite narrow scope when it comes to that, even before MiCA. But now with MiCA, the scope is generally quite narrow, right? And actually not a business model you should rely on anymore, right? So, but then you get into specifics like, my business is fully decentralized. Well, is it really decentralized? Probably not. It depends, right? And then even if you think MiCA may not be applicable to you, it may well be. Right. And there are so many things that you need to go through. So once you've done all that, right, then they ask, so what about licensing? Like, how fast can we get a license? Well, it depends. Do you already have a VASP registration somewhere, right? What's the transitional period? I believe there are some countries and jurisdictions that have already put out their transitional periods that can be quite short to non-existing, and I think recommended is like 12 months, if I'm not mistaken, which is already not a lot, because if you have worked at large exchanges and large institutions and CASP in this space, like the requirements that MiCA puts on them is quite heavy, right? And then with the RTSs coming out and additional requirements, it is quite. So the operational impact is another point that you need to look at. It's a longer work stream, right, including gap analysis and all of that. But and then at some point it makes sense to start implementing some of these policies and procedures ahead of all of that, right? So that's another process. So when you combine all of that together, it's a long process that hopefully should have started already for most participants, but I can say that it hasn't for some that I've interacted with, right? So I probably left some stuff out, so that's maybe the other speakers can can add something to it. But generally that's my comment on that.
Great. Tommaso, any pitfalls maybe from your side?
Look, I think Marcel already mentioned probably the most important ones, right? I think what we are looking at right now is this period that is not yet even this transition period that we're talking about, is actually this transition before the transition, right? So all of these companies that are indeed, as Marcel was saying, looking at potentially establishing Europe, getting a license in Europe, in first of all deciding which jurisdiction, which member state to get a license in. So obviously there is a lot of work to be done. There is a lot of preparations that companies need to start doing right now, actually, or probably should have started already. And I think we can really go into the details, and these, I'm sure, can have a lot of interesting tips and useful tips on how to approach that. But I think what's really interesting right now is that on the one hand, as we're saying, we're still finalizing some of these rules, right? We still don't know how certain provisions in the MiCA text will actually be interpreted by the national competent authorities. There are still some of these questions that relate to non-fungible tokens, so NFTs, to first of all, as we discussed just before this whole meeting started, which tokens will actually be classified as financial instruments. And so if, as we all know at least, but I think it's useful to remind for the audience that if a certain token is considered to be a financial instrument, then it will be captured under the MiFID rules, not MiCA. Even if this financial instrument is tokenized, is put on chain, there is DLT that is basically used to issue this token on chain, but it doesn't really change the nature of that token, right? So there is a lot of questions that still need to be answered on NFTs, on, again, the classification of tokens as financial instruments or crypto assets. Also, and as I think this is a big question that everybody's still looking at, is DeFi. What exactly is meant in the market and crypto asset regulation when we're talking about decentralized finance? What is it meant that an entity providing fully decentralized services is excluded by the scope? What does it mean to provide partially decentralized services? There is a lot of these questions that have yet to be answered. And especially on DeFi, we are going to have to wait a few more months before getting any sort of clarity from the European institutions. So the first thing that we are expecting would happen, or at least that's what the MiCA regulation is saying, is that the European Commission will put out a report by the end of 2024 to try and clarify how then national competent authorities should be looking at the DeFi question, right? But again, the whole point remains that the MiCA regulation, and I think this is also an important aspect, the MiCA regulation, first of all, focuses on intermediaries, right? So when we're talking about DeFi, it's important to keep in mind that in a completely disintermediated environment, then these type of rules should not be applying indeed. But then at the same time, I think an interesting aspect of MiCA is really that it's a regulation that asks you to prove your claims. So if you're claiming to be decentralized, you will need to prove that. If you're claiming that your token will always be stable, right, a stable coin, you will need to prove that. You can't just be claiming that that's going to be the case, right? If you're marketing what you're issuing, what you're putting out on the market, on the European single market, and for consumers to access, then you will need to make sure that your claims are substantiated by proof of reserves in the case of stable coins and other requirements in the case of other aspects. Anyway, I think this was just I wanted to take a bit of a step back on this, because yes, there is a lot that already firms are supposed to be doing right now, but at the same time, we also understand that a lot of these firms are still wandering around asking whether do I even need to do a MiCA license? We are a decentralized network. Why will we be captured by the rules, right? So I would say let's stop it now, there for now. But I think there is a lot of questions that still need to be answered before even being able to provide those, to get these licenses and actually get, authorized to provide services under MiCA.
Yes, exactly. And I think everything you just, Marcel and Tommaso, could be a podcast as itself, because you have a lot of reply to what you're saying also, Tommaso, is yes, everything is still not set in stone. So that's the main challenge here. So in the regulatory strategy that each CASP will have to define for themselves, they will take this big criteria into consideration. Why? Because what does it mean that things are still not set in stone? It means that the national competent authority is also learning in the process. That means they're also discovering new things. They also hire new people for it. So that's for this reason, it's very important to take this as a criteria when you come back to the jurisdiction choice, this criteria into your consideration, how the national competent authority is learning this process, how they are dealing with all those changes, are they willing to learn into the dialogue? And I think that's one of the criteria of course, you have to, like you also mentioned, Marcel, of course, the tax purposes, you also purposes as well. What do you prioritize, more a cost-efficient approach or more maybe the reputation of a country? But I think after all this, the first important one is actually the regulator, because you will communicate with the regulator on a monthly basis, weekly basis, is up to you to decide, but you will talk with them and you will have this back and forth exchanges with them. So this is more than important for you to really understand that, and not just doing the implementation in one hand and then in December basically pray that the license will be accepted. It should be when you ask for this license in December 2024 this year, it should be almost a formality, because you already had this discussion with the regulator along the way, since if you start right now to December, and that way you almost know 95% you're already gonna get it. So I think that's really the main things to, because of course you have a long process of things to do. Exactly the first you also mentioned, Marcel, is what are you really need a MiCA license? Do you really need it? What type of services you're providing now, but maybe what type of services you will provide in the future also. What type of license today you have? Maybe we can leverage actually some license you already have as authorized financial institutions, because heads up a little, for CASP you need this authorization for MiCA, for offering those services related to MiCA. But if you're an authorized financial institutions, you only need to notify the competent authority. So if you already have a sort of authorized license, this traditional world, you just need to comply with the requirements. You don't need to ask for the license. So this is something also very important to note, that if you already have some sort of a license, you need to check if maybe you don't need this MiCA authorization process, but just have a top-up compliance in order to provide those services. You need the 40 days notification, and that's it. But you still, of course, need to have some requirements. It's not just I would like to offer this service and then and that's it. So you, of course, need to implement some changes in your structure in order to really be compliant to it. But this is, so you have different strategy, either leveraging existing one, either going through a VASP, then to a MiCA license, because some national competent authority, they have this transitional, I would say, licensing process where already some requirements under the national jurisdiction is quite similar to MiCA. So you only can basically transition before the transitioning period, like you were saying. So you have this, and then you have also, if you don't have anything, of course, you need to go directly to this MiCA license without even, of course, if you are under the services and on the token issuance that MiCA is covering. So a lot of things here. That's one thing for sure. But one point I would like to raise is really the conclusion of this is things are changing, things are evolving, and the regulators are also learning in the process. So that's when you are in a jurisdiction where you see the regulators is willing to do so, this is already a very big, I would say it should be the priority, because that will set the tone for your application probability of being accepted, and also to show them you are serious, to show them that you're trustworthy, and that you're also willing to basically show what good look like for them. And for them, it's very reassuring as well. So here you have this, so something I don't think the industry, I think in 20 years, I don't know, I was too young before after 20 years, but I have seen so far. So that's quite an interesting moment. Also, if you are in the industry, you would like to learn as well, it's a moment for it, because also the regulators is not just giving you task and then it's a one-way discussion. It's really a both-way discussion, and that's very, very important to really understand.
So if I can summarize this, right, because we're talking about concrete steps, right, have a MiCA strategy. And best case, you should have already, and probably a month or years ago. But, and not only that, I think a dedicated team, right, is really important, even if you're a smaller company. And I think that's where consultants come into play, and external counsel and stuff like that, because it's a lot to tackle, and usually you have limited resources internally, right? So I think that's underestimated a lot. Also, the burden of reading through all these regulations, because it's not only MiCA that applies to you, right? GDPR and DORA and whatnot, right? So and by the way, there have been lots of confusions also with my international clients in regards to the difference between a regulation and a directive in Europe. So because they're saying, so we are safe now, right? We are covered under MiCA and we just need to follow this one document. I said, well, no, because your KYC and KYC process, if you're going to Germany, is under the MLD directive, and it's a directive. So Germany has its own implementation of that directive, meaning that you need to be fully compliant with that locally. So just because you have a MiCA license and you can passport it, doesn't mean you have a free license to be do whatever you want to do and be safe. You still need to look at applicable local regulations, not only MiCA. And don't underestimate that, because Germany is a good concrete example, right? In some jurisdictions, people do the KYC with a driver's license, and in Germany, it's just not allowed under the ML regulation. So if you have that in there, then it's going to be a problem. You have your MiCA license, but you can still get into trouble with the BaFin. So that's why have a strategy in place. Have a dedicated team. A team, if you're a smaller company, can mean 1 or 2 persons, but some are responsible. If you need to get a consultant or legal counsel requires more budget, of course. But all of that is I think these are concrete steps you need to take. And also, to summarize what we've already said and mentioned a couple of times now, be clear about your business, what services you're currently doing in the future, but then also jurisdiction, tax, all of that, your budget. It's very complex, right? But that's what makes it interesting, and I guess that's why we all need to navigate through this.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and I will even add also the services you're planning to also offer in the future. That's now the discussion with different competent authority in Europe that I am discussing with. They ask this information also: what type of today, but what type of planning in the future. And I think also how you display what you want to provide, it should be very clear for them. So imagine you really need to put yourself in there, saying, okay, you are maybe in the space for many years, but for them is a bit different. So you also need to share this information as easily as possible, almost as you're explaining to a 15-year-old what you're doing, basically. So I think this is part of the communication part with the regulator, but this is also very, very important, just to implement what you were saying, Marcel.
Yes.
And I think just wanted to pick up a couple of extra points Marcel was mentioning. Just to add to the layer of complexity, right, that we're talking about here, and especially when, as he was saying, on the difference between regulations and directives, right? The AML is a great example, because AML rules have been implemented in the European Union through directives until now, and so each the 27 member states have all different rules when it comes to AML, at least to some degree, right? Now, the AML will become a regulation. We've just finished lobbying here in Brussels on the AML regulation to ensure that some of these aspects and provisions, which again, we're talking about some very complicated topics when it comes to self-hosted wallets, KYC processes, and generally the idea of identity and privacy in a regulated environment, right? Especially when you're coming from the Web3 sector, idea of identity, privacy, pseudonymity, and how does that fit into a regulated environment. So very interesting also to keep that in mind for the future. Another layer of complexity is the MiFID, which is a directive. And so that means that each member state has also a different understanding and definition of financial instruments. So what we were mentioning just a few minutes ago, that also really depends and will have a great impact on where it's better for your company to actually establish itself, because there might be a jurisdiction like Germany that will likely be classifying some assets as financial instruments, while the same assets might not be classified as financial instruments in another jurisdiction. So that's also very important. And I think this also goes a bit to the, let's say, the questions that we are getting also in the chat, right? The idea that when we talk about regulators and authorities, of course, it might seem very abstract as a concept, right? But in this case, we're really talking about the national competent authorities, right? So those institutions, those authorities that Lisa, for example, is talking to already with, that are defined and decided by the member states, right? So in Italy, for example, where I'm from, the competent authorities will be the Banca d'Italia, so the Italian central bank, that will take care of, let's say, the more money-related issues and aspects like that. So it's more of let's say, the side of the European Banking Authority, right? And then we have CONSOB, which is instead the authority that deals with financial regulation, financial instruments, and so on, promotion of financial instruments. And so that's already important to know which authority to go and talk to. So to answer some of the questions we're getting, those are the regulators that are appointed by the member states. And so to have an influence, I guess you should go vote as a general reminder to try and have an influence on the way that your own country takes certain decisions. But the more interesting part of that question that we got is the expertise, right? How do we know whether these representatives from these institutions and regulators and authorities, that they actually understand what we're talking about, that they understand the differences between tokens, the difference between different projects, levels of decentralization, and all of that, right? So it's a very good question, and it's something that we know that the authorities are, I don't want to say worried, but of course they want to, they know that they need to gain this expertise, this understanding. They need to hire people that actually know these topics, right? So there is actually right now what's happening is that a lot of these authorities are rushing to try and get new colleagues and people that can actually work with them on these very complicated questions and topics, right? So once again, it's all of this, it's a complex system, it's a complex framework. The whole idea in the future is that all of these rules will basically be the same and very harmonized across the whole European Union, and it will not really matter in the future where you establish yourself, because you know that the authority will be competent, they will know what they have to do, they will take a similar approach and assessment regardless of the country. But until that point in time, it's true that there is this risk of fragmentation. And as ESMA talked about it in their letters that came out in October, I think, it's really this risk of regulatory arbitrage, right? The idea that companies for the next few months and years will be able to decide whether to go to a certain jurisdiction or another based on all these factors and criteria that we're talking about, which in the end will have a real impact on their operations. So a lot to keep in mind. But again, I think the whole point here is do talk with professionals like Lisa and Marcel that really have this understanding. On our side, it's more on whether you want to influence the future regulation, and if you do, you know where to find us. But it's a complicated moment. But I think overall, we should all be happy that we got this MiCA framework in place.
And knowing also that this list of national competent authority is technically not available yet, so we can just assume who are they be. So by assumption, you will go to your financial authority of your country. So in Belgium, we have the SMA, the Luxembourg, the CSSF, in France, the Autorité des marchés financiers, the AMF. So normally it should be them, but we still don't have the official names of who will remain the national competent authority. We just can assume. And one point that you also raised, Thomas, that you are completely right, and I think that can be a 2 hours discussion by itself, is the financial instrument versus crypto asset. And what is interesting when you go through cases on that topic, so the guidance where a crypto asset should be or not a financial instrument, is that actually it's the offerer or the person seeking admission to trading of these crypto assets that will be basically responsible for the classification of this asset, which is quite interesting to know. And then this classification can be challenged by this authority later on. So that's something also that we should not overlook, because I think, in my opinion, it's quite a responsibility to, as an offerer, to say, okay, this is, I think, a financial instrument, and this is not. And then the national authority will challenge. So I don't know what you think about Marcel on this, but I found it quite to follow.
Yeah, then you need to challenge that, and if the regulator doesn't give you the right answer, you go to the next jurisdiction until someone agrees with you.
Yeah, there was one other thing which at least came to my mind is we talked about AML, we talked about a lot of other responsibilities and requirements. But if we look at currently all the registered FASP or CASPs, currently they only need to comply in principle with AML legislation. If we look at MiCA, they also refer to conflicts of interest, market abuse. I'm just curious, Lisa, what are your thoughts about the additional compliance burden for the compliance staff in those organizations?
Well, like I like to say, MiCA is not interacting only by itself. You have a lot of different, it's like a tree, a lot of branches everywhere. And AML is one of this, KYC as well, travel rules, the same package. You have DORA as well, that is also a big one, to be honest. I didn't expect, I mean, when I started to read it, then of course, because they added basically DORA is for operational resilience in the financial industry. From the beginning, it was really if the operational issue in terms of resilience, or if they have a hack, basically they need to follow some rules. Each banks, each financial institution need to follow some rules in order to avoid this problem, because the impact of this can be important. If your bank has an ICT issue, it might have a lot of repercussion. For this reason, DORA is there, but DORA, of course, is covering those financial institutions. But right now they added the CASP little letter in the listing of who is under the scope of DORA. So right now, crypto asset service provider needs to comply with DORA as well, which is all 70 or 70 something pages. So that's quite something interesting, because when you read DORA, you have some reference to DORA as well. So to avoid the overlap, what I've noticed is they basically MiCA will handle any business continuity policy that is not related to the ICT system itself and leaves it to DORA. So then you can really avoid any overlap, because when you read it, at least this part, you might think, oh, I need to maybe do the work twice, but actually they made it in a way that MiCA will handle the non-ICT part of the resilience, I would say, and then leave to DORA the one that is for this operational ICT resilience per se. So yes, you have a lot of things to consider, and I think what will help is to have like a mind map, to see exactly when those jurisdictions are interacting and how they're interacting between each other to avoid this overlap. You might think that you will do the work twice, but actually what I read all those piece of legislation, you feel that they tried their best to avoid this overlap. So each regulation or directive, they really are focusing on specific items that are not overlapping. So that's my feeling when I'm reading through everything, which is well done. To be honest, it's a good thing that they did that.
Exactly. Well, I think we can talk for hours and hours. We promise our audience 30 minutes only, which I think all of us think is too short. So maybe we need to see if in the future we can have multiple other sessions to talk about all these different aspects. But for now, unfortunately, we have to come to a close of this roundtable. So this brings us to the end of the session. As I mentioned, unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you, Marcel, Lisa, Tommaso, for sharing your insights and expertise. And thanks to our audience for joining today's sessions. We hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next Compliance Insight Roundtable on April 4th. Have a great day.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
Good day, everyone.